Before we dive into actually looking at solver outputs, I want to spend some time diving into the various data elements that get generated by solvers called metrics and dimensions. Now, I imagine a lot of you, when you first look at solvers and solver outputs for the first time, may have a bit of a negative reaction. There's a lot of data and a lot of information in there. And oftentimes, people, when faced with a lot of overwhelming data, they tend to gloss over a little bit and often don't necessarily want to investigate or dive into that a little bit further. But when I think through, well, what is the purpose of analytics and what is the purpose of data analysis as it relates to solvers, as it relates to everything else, it's essentially trying to get from the picture on the left to the picture on the right. We have this nice bowl of M&Ms with a lot of different colors, and our goal is to make sense of that. And the picture on the right demonstrates that by sorting and organizing the data into a way in which we can actually interpret it and generate some insights. By looking at the picture on the left, it's impossible for us to really get a good sense as to how many of each individual color represents that entire bowl, but we can answer some more specific questions if we start doing a little bit of organizational work and organizing things like the picture on the right. And I know this is a somewhat simplified example, but I want to demonstrate this in a sense to help you understand that really at the end of the day, the outputs of a solver are just a set of data points. And those data points, while they may look like a jumbled mess, they can be manipulated and organized in certain ways to help answer some very specific questions for us, as long as we know what it is that we're doing in that organizational process. And that starts with understanding the foundational elements of that data, which are called metrics and dimensions. So we'll start with metrics. What is a metric? And for those of you who have taken some more advanced math classes especially in a business school or graduate level program, this may be a little bit of a review for you, but it's a nice way to make sure that we're all on the same page as to the definition of a metric, the definition of a dimension, because I'm going to be referring to those throughout the course of the rest of this module and the modules beyond this. So metrics are quantitative measurements. In the context of poker study, metrics are the outputs that mathematically describe a poker scenario. Things like expectation value, equity, the frequencies, anything that's a number within a solver is a metric. And metrics are quantifiable, so they are numbers. They can be counts, so they could be total number of things. That could be combinations or things like that. Or they can be ratios, like calculations, or they could be like equity is a ratio, or EQR is a ratio. Stack to pot ratio is a ratio. Metrics are related to the actions that are taken within a poker scenario, and both in theory and in practice. And at the end of the day, metrics are the basis for all of our data-driven analysis. Because after all, if we're going to be doing something from an analysis standpoint, we actually need raw numbers or some quantitative elements to be able to generate those analyses. So I mentioned metrics. Well, what is a metric and then what is a dimension? Metrics, as we've mentioned here, are quantitative, they're number-based, and metrics are not the same thing though as dimensions. Metrics are actually applied to dimensions. So what is a dimension? A dimension is the attribute or a segment on which you actually want to measure, and it's characteristic based. You can think of dimensions as a way of organizing the various metrics. Using our M&M example from the beginning, the metrics are the total number of those M&Ms, whereas the dimensions are the characteristics of the M&M. The color of the M&M is the dimension, whether it's red or blue or green or etc. That's a dimension. Dimensions and metrics are very, very different, but the two should always be used together because they're a powerful combination that can allow you to explain results and tell an actionable story much more effectively. It's not as effective for me to tell you how many M&Ms are in a jar It's also not as effective for me to tell you that there are red, blue, green, and brown M&Ms in the jar. But if I can tell you how many of each of the individual color M&Ms are in the jar, now I'm able to tell a more complete story. Some examples of metrics and dimensions as it relates to poker. From a metric standpoint, we have things like expectation value, equity, the percent of time that a player takes an action at a node, such as calling or folding or betting or raising. So those are the strategic action frequencies. The percent of the pot that our expectation value represent, which is noted as EV percentage. The amounts that we over-realize or our equity due to gameplay conditions such as position and or future actions. That's referred to as EQR or equity realization. All of these are metrics, and if you notice a common thread with these, they're all numbers. They're all data points. Dimensions can be things like hand classes that are describing particular hands, like pocket pairs or suited aces or Broadway cards. They could be hand classes that describe the rank of those hands alongside the overall board. So things like a set, top pair, combo draws, etc. They could be board descriptors for a texture of a board. So maybe things like, if you're describing a flop, like a rainbow flop or a two-tone flop or a paired flop. They could also be cards that describe the elements of a change to the board on turns and rivers. So maybe a brick card or a flush completing card or a board pairing card. But again, if you notice looking at the dimension side, it's something that's a descriptor, whereas the metric side is quantifiable. Let's drill into metrics a little bit more because there are a few different types of metrics and it's important to understand which types are which. So when we do dive into some analyses using these metrics, we can have an understanding of how to manipulate those metrics and how to interpret those data points. So the three types of metrics that we're going to look at are absolute metrics, derived metrics, and normalized metrics. I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail, but at a high level, absolute metrics are simply quantifiable metrics that can be counted. So the number of combinations is an absolute metric. It can be counted, it can be added together really easily, but it is a purely countable metric. Expectation value is a counted metric. Derived metrics are a combination of absolute metrics to determine a relevant ratio. EV percentage is a derived metric. That is a metric where we take the expectation value and divide it by the pot size to get a derived metric that gives us an explanation of something in relation to something else. And then a normalized metric is a metric that anchors absolute or derived metrics to be able to compare them across different types of scenarios. And they're actually a type of derived metric. So EV percentage, which I just mentioned, is also a normalized metric. The normalized metric tends to be always between 0 and 1 because, again, in that case there, we're able to compare them across different scenarios. Let's dive into absolute metrics a little bit more. Absolute metrics, as I've mentioned, are simple quantitative metrics that can be counted. Examples of these are things like the number of combinations of a particular hand or expectation value. Now, the benefits of these types of metrics is that they can be simply measured, first off. It allows you to determine the overall magnitude of the data. So it's easy to see and understand that an expectation value of 200 big blinds is twice as much as the expectation value of 100 big blinds. It's also easy to understand when you're actually trying to explain this to other people. The cons is that it's easy to misinterpret this without context. So going back to the example of an expectation value of 200 versus an expectation value of 100, well, that's a big difference. However, if in context the pot size is 2 million, well, that expectation value difference of 100 is not going to be that huge. Whereas if the pot size is 400, well, now an expectation value difference of 100 is a pretty big deal. So without that context, it's a little easy to misinterpret those. It's also difficult to compare those across different scenarios or dimensions. It's hard to compare a scenario in one pot versus another pot if the pot sizes are very, very different because we are anchored at a different level of the pot size. So absolute metrics ultimately should be used to either weigh the various segments within your analysis or to try to build more advanced derived or normalized metrics. Our next metrics here are our derived metrics. And as I mentioned here, they are a combination of absolute metrics to determine a relevant ratio or value. Some examples of this are equity realization, which is a measure of how much we over-realize or under-realize our equity in a particular hand. Or nut combinations, which is a subset of the overall combinations in one's range. But I define nut combinations as the number of combinations that one player has in range that is greater in value than the other player's best hand in their range. Now, the pros are that these are somewhat easy to understand and they can give a better picture sometimes of typical behavior, and they can also give you a comparison across segments, but they do still require a little context. So going back to nut combinations, that does require context in understanding the overall size of one range versus another. And these also can be skewed a little bit by outliers. But ultimately, derived metrics should be used to compare things across various segments. And then finally, our last type of metrics here are normalized metrics. And these are the metrics that are anchoring absolute or derived metrics so that we can compare things across different types of scenarios. So there's a lot of these types of metrics in Hold'em. So types of metrics include things like equity, strategic action frequency, EV percentage, or nut combination density, which is a cool metric that I've kind of built out that takes those nut combinations and anchors them to the overall size of one's range. Now, the pros of these is it helps you compare things across segments, and they also have a maximum and minimum value, so they can't be overly skewed in one way or another. But they can become a little bit complicated, and with that nuance, it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes to explain those concepts to others. But ultimately, normalized metrics should be used to compare values within and across segments. And really, at the end of the day, we should be using all three of these different types of metrics. And the last thing I want to cover as it relates to metrics is a type of metric called a KPI, or key performance indicator. And within the game of Hold'em, our primary KPI is EV, an expectation value. Now, KPI, as I mentioned here, stands for key performance indicator. It's a metric that can be used to identify success and to determine the overall performance of our various analysis. All KPIs are metrics, but not all metrics are KPIs. So anytime you have a key performance indicator within your particular analysis, it's always going to be a subset of the metrics, but not all metrics are going to be our key performance indicators. Not all metrics are just that important. The KPI is a flagship metric, and what that's going to do is help you understand how well you are doing against your goals and objectives. And again, in our case of Hold'em, our goals and objectives are usually to try to make the most money as possible, and that's going to be measured by expectation value. When in doubt in an analysis, so when you're looking at all of these different data points like equity or equity realization and so on and so forth, just fall back on your KPI, which is expectation value. And as I mentioned here again, in poker, our primary KPI is expectation value. The amount of money that we expect to win or lose from any poker decision is our KPI, and that should be our guiding light in all of our analyses. So that does it as an intro on metrics and dimensions, and I hope that foundational piece makes a bit of sense. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, in the next video, I'm going to be walking through actual solver outputs and how to look at those solver outputs from a macro to micro perspective. So I'll see you in the next video.